welcome to Tearing Off, the side series I make since animation takes time and I gotta fill in the gaps somehow. This time I wanted to talk about emulation and why I think it rocks. For those of you who don't know what emulation is, it's basically a program that pretends to be a certain system so you can run that system's games and programs on a modern device without needing to make a native port for it. At least that's the general gist of things. Emulation is everywhere these days. It's on PCs, consoles, phones, and probably a whole other section of devices I don't know about since I only really know about 3 different types of electronics. The point is, if it has a CPU, it probably has an emulator developed by some dedicated programmer. Needless to say, a lot of folks use emulation these days. Yes, even Nintendo for the re-releases of older games on the Switch. As a matter of fact, a good majority of ports tend to be emulated, especially re-releases of real old titles from like the 90s and 2000s and such. It's actually pretty rare to see a game get a re-release that was built from the ground up, or at least based off of the original game's source code. As far as I know, the reason for this is because it tends to be cheaper to make an emulator for a console that can run several games from that generation versus a single game that's built from the ground up that utilizes newer hardware. In other words, it just tends to be the most cost-effective solution. That said, emulation isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all situation by any means. Some games are easier or harder to emulate. I believe it depends on what the game uses internally and how hard it would be to recreate that feature with a program. Some of these take decades to get down, and they aren't even 100% accurate, with there sometimes being games that just can't be emulated for one reason or another. Speaking of not being 100% accurate, I suppose now would be a good time to get into emulation's downsides. As mentioned earlier, emulators aren't always going to be 100% accurate to the original systems they were built for. I mean, obviously they're likely never going to be 100% accurate to the systems they're emulating, but that's fine. Most of the time that doesn't really matter since emulators tend to be close enough that they still replicate dips in performance that the real deal would experience, among other things. However, that close enough mentality does occasionally result in bugs that wouldn't exist otherwise. Now, it's not nearly as bad as companies like Nintendo would like you to believe, especially these days with how refined community-made emulators have gotten, but I do still find it worth mentioning. Not to mention the fact that while emulators themselves are legal, the most common method of getting these 30-year-old ROMs that haven't seen a faithful or at least decent re-release often isn't. I mean, technically speaking, while companies don't like you doing it, to my knowledge it is perfectly legal to purchase a secondhand copy of, say, Super Mario World alongside a device that lets you rip the ROM from the cartridge. Good luck with that if you're going after a game like Earthbound though. Shit's gonna cost you about a quarter of the amount you would have to pay to fix a broken arm in the United States. Now, okay, that was a cherry-picked situation. If you're willing to dish out the dough for a cartridge of that price, it's likely you're either a collector or a real stickler to experiencing games on the console they were designed for. And admittedly, I am somewhat in that second category. I wouldn't go so far as to say that if you emulate, you didn't actually play the game. God no, this video is supposed to be talking about why emulation rocks. You're literally playing the game. It's right there. But I can still see the appeal in playing a game on the original console. It's simply how it was intended to be played, what it was designed around. You put Rystar on the PlayStation 3 and it's like, yeah, whatever, I can also play Rayman Origins and Bioshock on this. But then you play the same game on the original Sega Genesis, complete with an original cartridge, gamepad, and era-appropriate CRT, and, well, I feel like you'd have a little bit of a different experience. This was, by all means, how the game was meant to be played. Sitting down on a couch in front of a fuzzy CRT that slightly smooths out the harsh edges and blends the colors, using the original controller the developers had in mind when playing the game, all on hardware where those 16-bit graphics were considered cutting edge. You just don't get quite the same experience when you're emulating. I mean, by all means, you are playing the same game, going through the same levels, seeing the same sights. It's not an astronomical difference by any means, but it's noticeable. Emulation will likely never be able to create those same feelings. You may be able to get close to the same sensations, but you'll never be able to recreate them full on. That said, I feel like there's also room to play games as you intend on playing them. Be it a total purist who wants to experience the game as the developers intended, original hardware and everything, or someone who wants to tinker with anything and everything when given the chance. Massive tangent aside, you also have to bear in mind that not all emulators are created equal, especially officially made emulators, whether or not they were made in-house or were contracted. A lot of the time you go for a console port of older games, you get lucky if you have a bad CRT filter and can change the bind for the jump button. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand that companies like Sega and Nintendo have different standards, and when it comes to consoles, customizability isn't often a big selling point. For a lot of people, bare bones is all they need, and so long as it functions well enough, maybe with some very light input lag, I don't really have too much of a problem either. For me, emulation on consoles tends to just be good enough. But then you look at PC emulation and it's like decades ahead of what the big guys are doing. Even there, every emulator is different. Varying degrees of accuracy, stability, customizability, tools, the list goes on. Certain games that work for one emulator just won't work for another, and sometimes certain games work better on certain emulators. These days there's somewhat standardized emulators on PC and such, but that still doesn't change the fact that some games just won't run on certain emulators, or will and run very poorly. It's mostly an issue when it comes to emulators for newer consoles, but it does crop up from time to time with older games. Even with the legal ambiguity and accuracy and inequality of these things, I still stand by the idea that emulation kicks ass. For starters, especially when talking about emulation on PC, these things have a few features that just make playing older games a little better. At the very least, they tend to have a save state function, which is a godsend for games that didn't originally have save batteries in their cartridges, or forced you to write down a password to get back to where you were. Now it's just a shortcut, a way to save and load your game. There also tends to be a CPU speed setting, letting you speed up or slow down a game. Good for NES RPG fans who respect their time or are masochists. And of course there's rewinding, which really just does what it says on the tin. People are little bitches use this feature, and by people, I of course mean me. The one downside to these main features, as I'll call them, is just the fact that I tend to use them a little too often. I always feel like I'm cheating to some degree when I use them, which is funny considering there also tends to be some sort of cheat code feature in a lot of emulators as well. I mean, I suppose to some degree I literally am cheating, especially with rewinds and such. I'm literally reversing time to undo my past mistakes. I mean, there's at least an argument for save states, that being, well, it's just a save point. And to that degree it is, up until I wind up overusing it and getting stuck in a death loop. And then there's fast forwarding, which mostly just feels like a quality of life improvement when playing basically any NES era JRPG, but slowing the game down, totally cheating, no doubt about it. And despite all my nitpicks with those features, it all just boils down to misuse and overuse. With most if not all emulators, you have the option to outright turn these features off, so it's not that big of a deal. I'm really just going on about how I personally fall into the trap of, well, I have it, I may as well use it, when it comes to these features on emulators. Of course, those features aren't the only features on most emulators for PC. You also have binding, which is outright a necessity for PC. Some have the ability to record and edit inputs you make on certain frames, letting you go back and edit them, which wound up becoming a whole subsection of speedrunning called tool-assisted speedrunning, or TAS for short. It's not exclusive to emulators to my knowledge, but it's the first thing that comes to my mind when it comes to tool-assisted speedruns. A lot of emulators also have shaders, which pretty much change the look of the game you're playing. It's not a feature I tend to play around with all too much outside of maybe gamma correction or this one really good CRT filter for RetroArch, but I'd imagine you'd find a lot of other ones out there. Far better than anything I've seen from shit like the Sega Vintage Collection, which only has this one pixel smoothing effect that sort of tries to smooth out the pixels, but it doesn't do it in the same way a good CRT filter would. Oftentimes it just looks like improperly melted perler beads. I've also heard it described as someone pouring Vaseline all over the pixels. Of course, I go on and on about the countless features that emulators have and how they help people have a bit of an easier time when playing older games all day. But at this rate, I'm mostly just beating around the bush of what I really think makes emulation so cool. I'm the type of person who holds preservation of media, no matter how bad, to a really high level of importance. Yeah, sure, you can't save everything, but you can save a lot. And preservation is something that emulation just so happens to be really good at. Not by itself, of course, but I would say that emulation does play a sizable role in the preservation of video games. I was born in the mid-2000s, and a lot of the games I experienced when I was a kid were via emulation. Had emulation never existed, I would have never known the likes of Rystar, Echo the Dolphin, and Dynamite Heady, just to name a few. Had it been made illegal, well, there's a good chance that games such as Earthbound would have never seen a resurgence at all. My point being, had emulation never existed or been made outright illegal, a good chunk of games would be lost to time, doomed to stay on old hardware that would slowly decay as the years went on. Worse yet, there'd be no other way to experience a game that was released on, say, the Sega Genesis. I mean, you could record gameplay to somewhat preserve the game, but games were meant to be played. That's how they were supposed to be experienced. And again, had emulation never existed, I personally wouldn't have experienced a lot of older games, and I'm sure that goes for so many other people as well. Retro gaming is quite the expensive hobby after all. I mean, sure, maybe you get lucky and are handed down an old SNES and a bunch of games from your cousin, but that's not the case for everyone. And that's not even getting into games that are particularly rare either. In other words, not only does emulation allow the preservation of video games to be a long-lasting endeavor by providing a way to experience these titles, but it makes playing older titles far more accessible than it would be otherwise. Be it to experience older titles far easier, or for the sole sake of preservation. It makes it all the more sad to know that companies such as Nintendo attack emulators, saying that it does damage to their profits. And while there's no denying that, especially when it comes to emulators that emulate modern consoles, when it comes to games from 50 years ago, I struggle to see the argument. They don't even make a profit on games that were released 10 years ago. They stopped selling Wii U games, let alone Wii and GameCube games. And frankly, that's also assuming emulation truly does as much damage to a company's profits as they claim. When given the choice, and when put into a situation where it's viable, a majority of people prefer to go the legitimate route. So in all due reality, accompanied by the fact that many of these games have been off sale for decades, the amount of damage that emulators deal is, in all likelihood, overblown. Just another boogeyman that large game companies such as Nintendo, Sony, and Sega point to in order to explain why their profits are lower than usual to their investors. Anyways, I'm sure I've made my point clear as to why emulation is cool and awesome. Objectively. Now do the YouTube shit. Or don't. You have free will. Presumably. Asterisk even.